Thank goodness you said that, Alison.
That's okay.
Okay, right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's Glasgow Archaeological Society lecture. I'm hoping that this is going to be the final completely on Zoom lecture we have this year. Next week, we will be hopefully going to be back next month back in the Boyd Orr building. I'll mention that at the end in terms of what the arrangements are for next time around and our next speaker. But this evening, I'd like to introduce the legendary figure within British archaeology, Dr. Alison Sheridan, who up until fairly recently was the curator of early prehistory in the National Museums of Scotland. Now retired, but as far as I can tell, busier than ever and in more demand than ever. Alison is really one of the the great figures in modern British archaeology. Has in the last few years has won a series of notable awards according to a Wikipedia page. I do know this really, but including in 2020 being voted Archaeologist of the Year by current archaeology readers, and you've won many other prestigious awards as well. And also, one thing that I do want to mention also is your absolutely incredible series of Rind lectures that you gave during the midst of one of the worst of the lockdowns, a real tour de force of a study of the Scottish Neolithic, and all those lectures are available to view online through the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland YouTube page, and I highly recommend that you check those out if you want to find out the current state of play in Neolithic studies in Scotland. But this evening, Alison's going to be talking about a site that I'm sure many of us are very fond of. Anyone who's visited Callanish will have found this site to have left a huge impression on them because of its stunning standing stones and the setting, and also the landscape as well. All of it's incredible. But I think actually a lot of us don't really quite know the details of the archaeology of Callanish. And so this evening, that gap in our knowledge is going to be filled in by Alison, who's going to be talking about Callanish in context, new light on a ceremonial landscape in Lewis. Now I'll hand over to Alison to give her a talk now, and once she's finished speaking, then we'll be able to do questions through using the chat function or the Q&A function that you should have access to as audience members. So please do drop your questions in there during the talk, and I'll make sure that Alison sees them and is able to hopefully answer them as well. So Alison, I will pass over to you to tell us all about Callanish.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Yeah, Callanish is a site that's very dear to my heart too, because it featured on my wedding cake 34 years ago. And we gave an aerial photo to the cake maker, and the stones came out not quite to scale, but they were delicious. So if you're one of the 120,000 plus visitors from all around the world who in a normal year visit the complex stone setting at Callanish on the island of Lewis, you'll be well aware of what a majestic, awe-inspiring and photogenic monument this is, prominently located on a local ridge with its beautiful stones of Lewisian gneiss, the oldest rock in the world, glinting in the sunshine and in the moonlight. Callanish has attracted and impressed visitors for millennia. It may well be that the classical writer Diodorus of Sicily was referring to it when he wrote in 55 BC in his account of the Hyperboreans who lived at the edge of the known world. There is also on the island a notable temple, which is spherical in shape. The moon, as viewed from this island, appears to be but a little distance from the earth. The god visits the island every 19 years. The archaeoastronomical aspects of the monument have indeed attracted a great deal of comment and speculation over the centuries, and I'll be coming back to this a little bit later. Meanwhile, if I can, oh, hello, it's not advancing.
Try and just do right click.
I'm doing a right click.
Oh.
Okay, I do stop share and start sharing again.
Yeah, do stop and start again. It's maybe just frozen up a wee bit.
Okay, sorry, folks. It was. Okay, can you see that now?
No, it's just me and Stephen.
Right.
Ooh.
Okay, don't go away, folks.
No one's going anywhere.
Good. Share screen. You'll see the horror of my screen. That's it.
Oh, here we go.
Right, from beginning.
Yeah, here we go. That's it. You're on.
Start beginning. Next one.
Oh,
Hooray.
yes.
Thank heavens. Thank heavens. Right, okay. Meanwhile, the monument has meant a lot of things to different people over the years. In 1792, Colin Mackenzie recorded that the local name for the monument was Nafir Crachia, meaning false men, and I apologize for my execrable pronunciation of Gaelic. And this related to the belief that the stones are actually petrified men who were turned into stone as a punishment for dancing and walking down to Loch Roag nearby on the Sabbath. A belief that was celebrated in this postcard, which was based on an 1867 engraving charmingly titled Tursacan Callanish as seen under the influence of spirits, and more recently commemorated in this 1985 art performance by George Wiley called The March of the Standing Stones. Today, people flock to the stones for various reasons, including to get married. So congratulations, Lou and Tim. To make teleprograms, and to soak up whatever magical vibes they believe the stones to emit. On the internet, people bang on endlessly about the mystery of the stones and how we know nothing about the people who built and used them. And indeed, this woo-woo angle is a major selling point in the popular promotion of the stones. But what I hope to do in this lecture is to debunk that view and de-woo-woo the monument while acknowledging and understanding its profound significance to the people who built and used it up to 5,000 years ago, and to show just how much we do know about the monument and its wider landscape and wider context, thanks very largely to the excavations and survey work that was carried out between 1979 and 1988 by Patrick Ashmore for the predecessor organisation of Historic Environment Scotland. This weighty and compendious electronic tome, available free online, comes in at a whopping 1,246 pages and about 500,000 words. So that makes it both great bedtime reading, honestly, and the highest density of words per excavated square metre of any excavation report that I've come across anyway. Luckily for you, I'm not going to be taking you through it page by page, but I do want to acknowledge the immense contribution that it's made to our understanding of this monument and its landscape. Many of the images that you'll see in this talk are from that publication. But what I intend to do this evening is to start by introducing the monument. Then I'll take you through the complex story of its construction, modification and use between around 2900 BC and around 1800 BC, also looking at what was going on before it was built and after it was abandoned, at every stage setting it within its wider archaeological context. I'll then say a little bit about the numerous other standing stones and stone circles in the area, and what we still need to find out about the prehistoric archaeology of this part of Lewis. And I'll end by talking about the exciting developments at Orkney, the Callanish Stones Trust, which runs a successful visitor centre and supports active research on behalf of the local community. So let's crack on. For those not already familiar with the monument, it's located close to Loch Roag, a sea loch on the northwest coast of the island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. It's the largest and most complex of a series of standing stones and stone circles in the area. Its current form, as you can see from this magnificent aerial photograph looking roughly west, it consists of a circle, as you can see here, with a tall central standing stone, and encompassing a small chamber tomb that's a bit hard to see here, but that's the small chamber tomb there, with short rows extending to the south, the east and the west, and a long avenue extending to the north. Just to the south is a rock formation called Knock and Torsa, there you go, the Hill of the Sorrows. And to the south of that, the land slopes down to the shore of Loch Roag. But the monument hasn't always looked like this, either in the recent past or in the distant past. From sometime in the first or early second millennium AD until 1857, the chamber tomb and the lower 5 feet, the best part of 2 meters of the individual stones, were blanketed in peat as you can see from this early sketch by the great Danish antiquary Jens Forså, made in 1846 during his grand tour of Scotland. In this view, and also in another that was made in 1856 to accompany Henry Callender's note on Callanish in volume 2 of the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, you can see that the local people had been cutting the peat as they were cultivating the ground right up to some of the stones. Callender suggested that the society should approach the landowner, James Matheson, to strip away all of the peat to allow antiquarian exploration of the monument. Clearly, they did just that, for in October 1857, Matheson had all the peat stripped away, revealing the full height of the stones and exposing the chamber tomb. In this early photograph, this daguerreotype taken by James Valentine, probably in the early 1860s, to encourage tourists to visit, you can see the stark colour difference between the lower parts of the stones that had been bleached by the peat and the upper, darker, weathered parts of the stones. If you cast your mind back to the postcard of the petrified men, you can see how the white parts of the stones became their trousers. But I also said before that the monument's appearance had also changed in the more distant past. This is because we know, thanks to the painstaking excavations and radiocarbon dating program by Patrick Ashmore, that not all of its constituent parts were erected at the same time. It appears that the stone circle and its central tall monolith were constructed first, probably around 2900 BC. The small chamber tomb inside the circle was then added nearly 500 years later, around 2450 BC. And I shall go through the evidence that allows us to say this in a few minutes. The back of the cairn abuts the central monolith, while the entrance was positioned facing roughly east in a gap between two of the cairn stones. It may well be that the rows and the avenue also constructed at or around the same time as the chamber tomb. Patrick Ashmore found it hard to date these and to tell whether they were all built at the same time. There's just one radiocarbon date available, but this shows that stone 30 in the east row was erected at some point between 2560 BC and 1690 BC. So in theory, that row at least could have been erected during the 25th century when the tomb was built. Therefore, what we see today is a palimpsest rather than a single phase construction. The monument's appearance and use changed quite radically over the course of its long evolution. I shall come back to the detailed life history of the monument in a moment, but first we need to have a look at what was going on in the area before any stones had been raised. And our story starts way back in the Mesolithic, during the 7th century BC, when there's evidence suggesting the burning of birch woodland at Callanish Leobag on a nearby peninsula jutting out into Loch Roag. And also there was a sudden decline in birch cover at Loch Builavail Beg to the northwest of Callanish. Now, while this could be due to natural causes like natural fires, it's also possible that this relates to the deliberate management of woodland by the small groups of hunter-fisher foragers that we know were present in the Outer Hebrides from at least as early as the 7th millennium BC. Burning trees and reducing forest cover in other ways can be a strategy to attract hunting prey, such as deer, to an area. So far, no Mesolithic artifacts have been found in the Callanish area, but on Harris to the south, work by Mike Church of Durham University has discovered numerous 7th century millennium flint tools, along with hazelnut shells and debris from camping. If we dial forward to the 4th millennium BC, this was a time when groups of farmers bringing a whole new way of life and a range of cereals and domesticated animals arrived and settled in the Outer Hebrides. Their arrival from the west coast of Scotland was part of a secondary expansion of farming groups from the Scottish mainland. A few generations earlier, their ancestors had arrived in Scotland and elsewhere in Britain from different parts of northern France. We can say that with some confidence, thanks to the DNA analyses of early Neolithic human remains from Scotland and elsewhere in Britain and Ireland. which have proved that the first four farmers had continental genetic ancestry, totally different from the genetic signature of the indigenous Mesolithic communities. The evidence for the presence of these farmers in the Callanish area takes the form of pollen dating to around 3700 BC, indicating the cultivation of cereals and the grazing of animals, probably cattle and sheep, at Callanish Leobag. Elsewhere in the Outer Hebrides, but not so much in Lewis, these early farmers were building magnificent monuments to house and commemorate their dead, such as this Patter's tomb at Barpalangus on North Uist. Clearly, farming took root, as it were, and by around 3500 BC, there's plentiful evidence for flourishing farming communities in the Outer Hebrides. At Callanish itself, there's pollen evidence for cultivation during the second half of the 4th millennium. And there are also these small and rather unprepossessing looking but significant sherds of pottery, which probably date to between 3300 and 3000 BC. These would have come from a nearby settlement and would have been chucked out onto the fields along with manure and other waste to help keep the soil fertilized. They were then moved some 500 years later into the area where the little chamber tomb was to be built, brought in among clay and earth used to create a platform. While the sherds don't look very spectacular, we know from much better preserved examples that have been coming up from diving on the Neolithic crannogs of Lewis, that the kind of pots from which they came were very impressive looking indeed. These large jars would have been used for cooking, and in the next slide, kindly provided by Duncan Garrow, you can see a large part of one such jar being lifted from the bed of Loch Langathat. And there you have it. We'll come back to the crannogs in a moment, but I just want to make the point that the farmers in the Outer Hebrides were well connected and were clearly competent sailors. There's evidence that they interacted with people in the north of Ireland from at least as early as 3500 BC, as shown, for example, by the discovery of this distinctive Hebridean Neolithic pottery at Port Stewart on the coast of County Derry on the Northern Ireland coast, and also by the discovery of axe heads made from porcelainite that came from either Teithbulia or Rathlin Island in County Antrim that have been found in the Outer Hebrides, including this spectacular example of a complete axe found at Shulishada. And we were able to radiocarbon date the haft to between 3300 and 3000 BC. There's also evidence, spectacular evidence, that the Hebridean farmers were interacting with their counterparts in Orkney in the centuries around 3300 BC, in the form of a very distinctive kind of bowl known as an Unston bowl, which is named after the chamber tomb of that name in Orkney. These pots, which form part of the ceramic repertoire in both Orkney and the Outer Hebrides, are so distinctive and so similar to each other that the similarity cannot be put down to chance. Rather, it seems as though certain people were making the 5 to 6 day long sea journey from Orkney to visit people in the Hebrides and vice versa. Why did they do that? Well, one hypothesis is that they were maintaining all important social ties, particularly among what we might call the elite. By undertaking long distance voyages and bringing back exotic ideas and things, people could enhance their standing in the local community. It could be that the places where the people from Orkney came together with the people of the Outer Hebrides were these amazing, small, artificially enhanced islets called crannogs, which are the focus of an exciting current research project led by Duncan Garrow, Fraser Sturt, and Angela Gannon, and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and Historic Environment Scotland. These crannogs appear to be too small to support a year-round dwelling place, but they could have been used for feasting and socializing and for impressing the visitors from Orkney. This existence of long-distance contacts and this toing and froing by boat along the Atlantic facade during the second half of the 4th millennium provides us with a vital clue as to why people decided to build a stone circle at Callanish around 2900 BC. To cut a very long story short, the evidence all points to the Callanish circle having been inspired by people seeing the newly erected stone circle with its enclosing bank and ditch at the Stones of Steness in Orkney, and wanting to bring this novel tradition of monument construction to the Outer Hebrides. You can see from this slide the obvious similarities in the use of tall, distinctively shaped stones, Orkney sandstone flags in the case of the Stones of Steness, and locally obtained Lewisian gneiss in the case of Callanish. To explain why I think this is the case, some background information is required. Since at least as early as 3500 BC, the prosperous and ambitious farmers of Orkney seem to have vied with each other to build ever bigger and ever better monuments for their dead. This process of competitive conspicuous consumption between prominent groups and individuals reached its zenith around 3200 or 3100 BC, when, thanks to the extensive network of contacts that linked Orkney and Ireland via the Outer Hebrides and the west coast of Scotland, as we've just seen, news will have reached Orkney of the amazing huge passage tombs of Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth in the Boyne Valley in eastern Ireland that had just been built. The elite of Orkney proceeded to make the long sea journey, and they came back with big ideas. In other words, they indulged in what the anthropologist Mary Helms has termed cosmological acquisition. These people trumped all of the preceding funerary monuments in Orkney by building Maze How to emulate Newgrange, down to its astronomical orientation on the midwinter sun. Although at Newgrange, it's the rays of the rising sun that travel along the passage and into the chamber, whereas at Maze How, it's the setting sun's rays that travel up the passage. Elsewhere, for example, at Pirawall on the island of Westray, they pecked sacred designs that are based on those that they'd seen at Newgrange on the lintel stone of their Maze How type passage tomb. These ambitious members of the Orkney elite were in effect creating a new world order featuring themselves on top. They invented the stone circle and its surrounding henge as a wholly new kind of monument for ceremonies at various times, including and especially at midwinter. They invented a wholly new kind of pottery, the flat-based grooved ware, whose decoration was inspired by Irish passage tomb art motifs. They made and wore ostentatious chunky jewellery made from materials including whalebone and sperm whale ivory. And they made and used a variety of funny shaped stone objects, which seem to have been used both as actual weapons, and we know that because there are skulls from Orcadian chamber tombs with blunt force trauma that correspond exactly to these objects. And these were also, very importantly, weapons of social exclusion, underlining the unequal nature of society in Orkney at this time. And it's as though the engine that allowed all this to happen was the fact that this was a very fertile area for farming, and they were certainly producing a lot of cattle, and they were having their cattle interbred with aurochsen on the mainland of North Scotland, so that they would have huge amounts of beef per cow or bull. These people also created the incredible site at the Ness of Brodgar, close to Maze How and the Stones of Steness, which featured increasingly large buildings with stone-slabbed roofs, which could well have been used to accommodate and entertain visitors who had come from far and wide to witness the wonders of the monumental landscape and to participate in the ceremonies, just as people had previously flocked to the Boyne Valley. And it seems as though many of these visitors indulged in cosmological acquisition of their own, taking back the idea of building stone and timber circles and of using grooved ware to where they lived, and no doubt using the ceremonies that they'd seen in Orkney. Here you can see a series of circles along the western seaboard of Scotland. You see Callanish there, Temple Wood in Kilmartin Glen, and Machrie Moor on Arran. And you can also see finds of grooved ware in the same areas and at some of these monuments. This map could be continued down to include Ireland, because in the Boyne Valley, for example, people not only adopted the use of grooved ware, but they also adopted the use of mace heads, and they even made beads that were miniature versions of Scottish carved stone balls. And here at Callanish, you can see that the stone circle is similar in size to the stones of Stenness, differing only in that it lacks the bank and ditch that encircled the monument in Orkney. It has 13 stones in the ring rather than 12, and it also has a central standing stone. The clincher, linking this unequivocally to Orkney, is the fact that part of an Orcadian-style grooved ware pot bowl was found just outside the circle. You could lose this pot among the pottery found at the stones of Stenness, Nesselbrodge, and Barnhouse. Date-wise, Patrick Ashmore was able to bracket the construction of the Callanish Circle around 2900 BC, which fits perfectly with the chronology of Stenness, which was built during the 30th century BC. Moreover, in the Outer Hebrides, there are a handful of mace heads and carved stone balls of exactly the same types as found in Orkney. And indeed, in Orkney, there are mace heads that are made from Lewisian gneiss that would probably have been taken up as raw material, as a precious exotic material. So I think we can conclude that the local bigwigs on Lewis wanted a piece of the prestige action that they'd seen in Orkney, and they set out to recreate the stones of Stenness at home, to adopt the ceremonies that they'd seen there, and to use Orcadian-style pottery and symbols of power. Going back to the circle at Callanish, the next question to ask is why it was located where it was. As you can see from this superb photograph by Grant Jones, it's in a truly spectacular landscape setting, perched as it is on a ridge leading up to a natural hill known as Knock and Tursa, Hill of the Sorrows. It's actually a roche moutonnée that's been smoothed by the action of ice during the Ice Age. At the southern edge of Knock and Tursa, there is a natural setting of 5 boulders with a cave-like gap between 3 of them. Excavations in front of this by Geraint Coles and Tom Rees for Edinburgh University in 1993, you can see the square of disturbed ground where their trench was, showed that there were rows of post holes along with pits and ditches with pottery and flint in them. Sadly, these features were subsequently obliterated when the path leading up to the stones was constructed, and sadly the results of the excavation haven't yet been published, but they will be. We're onto it. Even more interestingly, in 2013, the eagle-eyed local archaeoastronomy enthusiast Ian McHardy noticed that at midday in February, this cave-like feature served to focus the sun's rays as if in a collimator, sending out a beam through the slit at the front, projecting northwards. Further work that he undertook with another local archaeoastronomer, the famous Margaret Curtis, concluded that around midwinter, the midday sun would send out a particularly long ray directly in line with the tall central stone in the circle, which is aligned due north-south. Even though the position of the sun will have been slightly different around 2900 BC from today, when the circle was built, the difference is not so great as to have negated this special natural phenomenon. Moreover, the cave itself is deep enough for somebody to have stood in it to receive the sun's focused rays, along with whatever power that people may have believed it conferred. So, of course, it may well be that the post holes and pits that Geraint and Tom found were markers used to calculate the time of midwinter, and that this naturally auspicious spot formed the focus for the orientation of the central standing stone and its surrounding ring, and for the midwinter ceremonies that echoed those in Orkney. A similar central feature, orientated north-south, was found in the timber circle of Templewood North in Kilmartin Glen in Argyll. Much work has since been done to look for any significant astronomical orientations of the stone circle. Most recently, Dr. Gail Higginbottom of the University of Santiago de Compostela has used the archaeoastronomical software program Stellarium along with a tailored program created by Andrew Smith called Horizon, to work out exactly what one would see if one stood in the center of the circle looking south around 3000 BC or 2900. And I'm very grateful to Gail for allowing me to reproduce this as yet unpublished diagram. And I'd ask you not to take any screenshots of this or indeed of my other slides. Because the azimuth of Nokhantursa is due south, this means that celestial bodies reach their highest point above this hill as they progress across the sky. Gail has noted that people would have been able to observe the sun and moon rise and set in relation to Nokhantursa at various significant points in the solar year and in the longer 18.6 long lunar cycle. And yes, indeed, on and around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the sun would appear to skim along the top of Nokhantursa. This tallies with the evidence from the cave to suggest that midwinter was indeed an important time to be marked for these people, and that's when they carried out their main ceremonies. Gail's calculations also show that the full moon would appear to follow an arc in line with Nokhantursa at its minor standstill. So it's not impossible that this was also regarded as an auspicious time for the people who built the circle. But it's likely that the main concern with the builders of the stone circle was midwinter, as it had indeed been for the monument builders in Orkney. And just to remind you what's meant by the lunar terms major and minor standstill, here's a handy diagram showing significant points in the solar and lunar calendars, and the positions in the sky where the sun and moon rise and set at these times. While the sun has an annual cycle with the longest and shortest days at the midwinter and midsummer, midsummer and midwinter solstices and the equinoxes in between, the moon has both a monthly cycle of waxing and waning and an 18.6 longer cycle. A major standstill occurs when the moon rises and sets to the furthest north or south position. In between times, its rising and setting limits are defined by minor northern and southern standstills. It doesn't actually stand still in the sky, of course, but if you watch where it rises and sets each night, its extreme points are those which are reached every 18.6 years. Interestingly, it doesn't appear that the builders of the Callanish circle were interested in marking the moon's major standstill positions. All of this was to change, though, around 500 years later. If we move on in time to around 2500 BC, a period that we refer to as the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, we now see new construction taking place inside the circle and a change in its use. Green clay and earth containing the small sherds of by then ancient Neolithic pottery was brought in to create a level platform into which was slotted the foundations of a light timber structure, the thing that looks like a keyhole, with the edge of a platform bounded by a circular ditch. The remains were particularly ephemeral and hard to spot, but Patrick Ashmore feels that this wooden structure may have been used as a place to lay out the dead. If he's right, this represents a radically different use of a by then ancient monument. Very importantly, sherds of a new continental style of pottery known as beaker pottery were deposited in this foundation trench. And you can see the drawings of the pottery here. And this shows us that the inhabitants of Lewis were aware of the people who were coming over from various parts of the continent for various reasons at the time. Indeed, it's very likely that some of these continental so-called beaker people ended up on Lewis, since this pottery is very finely made by potters who were well versed in its tradition. But the structure that was built on the site doesn't look like any continental beaker funerary structure or any other structure for that matter, so the plot thickens. There's no time to go into detail here about the beaker people, but if you watch my series of Rhind lectures that are on the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland YouTube channel, you can hear all about them. In short, to put a Brexity kind of spin on things, here was a bunch of foreigners who came over and brought their funny foreign ways with them. Or to put it in more sedate archaeological terms, these new settlers who came over for a variety of reasons brought the knowledge of metal and metalworking, Britain and Ireland, as well as other novelties, including a tradition of burying their dead individually. Here's what one of these people would have looked like. This is so-called Eva, a child or grandchild of Dutch settlers, as we know from her DNA, who was buried at Achtervannich in Caithness and was subsequently studied by the wonderful Maya Hoole. And note that her complexion is darker, slightly darker than that of most of the modern inhabitants of Scotland. And here is the pattern of migration that's indicated by ancient DNA data, showing that different groups of people came from different parts of the continent to different parts of Britain. These people went on to have a major impact on the genetic makeup of the inhabitants of Britain. And it's been claimed that there was something like a 92% genetic turnover. But that's another story. Whether or not it was immigrants or indigenous people who deposited the beaker pottery at Callanish, what happened next owes nothing at all to continental traditions. Around 2450 BC, on the footprint of the timber structure, people built a miniature chamber tomb, a miniature passage tomb, if you like, as you can see here. And they deposited more of this early continental style pottery in the low cairn as it was being built. This was unequivocally a burial site, since the people who cleared out the chamber when the peat was stripped away in 1857 found the decayed traces of human bones, which have sadly not survived. So this means, in effect, that the ancient sacred monument was being appropriated for the burial and commemoration of one or more important person, probably a local leader, who wished to be associated with this hugely important monument. The choice of architecture is particularly interesting, since it would have been over 1,000 years since the last megalithic chamber tomb had been built in the Outer Hebrides. This suggests that people wanted to make a specific reference back to the time of their distant ancestors, perhaps as a way of legitimating their takeover of the stone circle. Either these were local people who wanted to demonstrate how hip they were by using the continental pottery, or it was foreigners who wanted to manufacture a Hebridean ancestry and identity for themselves. Either way, it was a fascinating thing to do. Moreover, if we are right in assuming that the West Row, the South Row, East Row, and the Northern Avenue were also constructed around the same time, this implies that there was an astronomical reorientation of the monument onto the moon. The Northern Avenue and the Southern Row suggest an interest in the movement of the moon on its southern path at the major standstill once every 18.6 years. At this time, the moon did and continues to do a most remarkable thing. As the full moon sets, it appears to skim along the horizon that's shaped like a woman lying down. Then it dips below the horizon before reappearing as it passes a notch in the horizon and gleaming bright within the silhouette of the circle. This fantastic photograph was taken by archaeoastronomer Gerald Ponting on the 12th of June 2006, the last time of the southern major standstill. The next one is due to happen in April 2025, so if I were you, I'd book your travel now. I fully intend to be there. In order to take this picture, Gerald was standing on Knock Tursa, but it's been claimed that it's possible to see the phenomenon, or at least part of it, from the northern end of the avenue. We await developments in 2025. Moreover, Gerald's former wife, Margaret, with her then husband, Ron Curtis, took this photo of one of them standing on Knock Tursa, who would appear silhouetted against the moon to people watching from the monument below. Powerful stuff, the man or woman in the moon. The fact that the Northern Avenue would direct a procession right up to the chamber and past it at this most auspicious time suggests that at play here was a very effective strategy to underline just how important was the person or people buried in the chamber. In effect, every time there was a major celebration of the moon's southern standstill, every 18.6 years, the celebrants would have to approach this tomb, And it's arguably not stretching the bounds of credibility to claim that the choreography of the ceremonies, especially if they included somebody standing as the man or woman in the moon, perhaps representing the spirit of the occupant of the tomb, was orchestrated so as to channel the power of the moon and bring this person's spirit alive again. We can but speculate. Back to the life history of the Callanish monument. Patrick Ashmore's forensic examination of the excavated evidence concluded that after the mini chamber tomb was built, people then constructed and then rebuilt some kind of enclosure or special purpose structure just outside the stone circle, and proceeded to deposit the kind of beaker pottery that tends to be found in settlements, including this large jar with cockleshell impressed decoration. From this, we might conclude that people continued to pay their respects to the illustrious ancestor or ancestors in the tomb. Dial forward a few generations, and we find that somebody else was buried here, immediately outside the circle in a shallow grave. To judge from the quiverful of arrows represented by the 6 fine arrowheads that you see in this picture, it's likely, very likely, that this was a man, and he was buried with the kind of beaker that you'd expect to find in a settlement. Date-wise, we're talking about sometime between 2150 and 1750 BC. Interestingly, the pollen evidence shows that people were farming right up to the edge of the stones at this time, just as they had done in the much more recent past in the 19th century. Thereafter, at some point between 2000 and 1700 BC, people deposited a large jar in the new-fashioned food vessel style of pottery on the cairn, either as part of an offering to the dead or as part of a burial ritual. We know that people were still cultivating cereals in the area, and then from around 1500 BC, it all goes quiet. And from 900 BC or thereabouts, the monument was encroached upon and then covered by the spread of blanket peat. Thanks to excavations undertaken in 1999 to 2000 by Edinburgh University at a site called Callanish Fields, not far away, we can fill in the gaps about what happened next. Under the peat, in the area now occupied by a glamping site, Mel Johnson and her colleagues found field walls, field clearance cairns, and other traces of farming and settlement that dated to sometime before 600 BC, let's say around 900 to 600 BC, with evidence for barley and oats being cultivated. It seems that the spread of peat didn't affect this area until around 700 BC in one part of it, and not until as late as 300 BC in another. Thereafter, things in the whole area went very quiet and indeed squelchy until around AD 900, when folks started to open up the area for cultivation again, and the medieval settlement of Callanish was established. So much for the sort of longue durée view of developments in and around Callanish. I now want to spend a few moments considering the numerous other stone circles and standing stones that are dotted around the area and are crying out to be understood. There are at least 10, probably 11 stone circles and 9 isolated standing stones within a few kilometers of the main Callanish site. Some years ago, an archaeologist decided to number them Callanish 2, Callanish 3, and so on to Callanish 22, but most also have Gallic names. Not a single one of them has been reliably radiocarbon dated. And so while we may assume that at least some of these are contemporary with the stone circle at Callanish 1, the main monument, we cannot be sure until we excavate and get radiocarbon dates. Was this a case of Me Too by other local groups who wanted to create the monuments of their own to rival Callanish 1? It could well be. Do these other stone circles have the same function? Were the single standing stones erected at the same time as the circles, and what was their function? Despite an awful lot of archaeoastronomical speculation, we really just can't say. Some of these circles, such as this circle at Callanish 2, Garach, and the double concentric circle at Callanish 3, Knockfillabeg, are intervisible with the main site, while others are further away. At one circle a little bit further away at Nadramanan, which was excavated by Colin Richards, it was found that all of the stones had collapsed because they had been set far too shallowly into the ground. Here is a virtual reconstruction that was done by Richard Bates as part of some work that he carried out on behalf of the Callanish Trust in 2018. And at Burranurrow Bridge, what we have here is just an arc of a circle edging onto the water. Surprisingly, very little scientific exploration has been made at these so-called satellite sites, although a lot of recording has been done by Margaret and Ron Curtis and Gerald Ponting. Calling them satellite sites is a value-laden term if ever there was one, and I'd rather not call them satellite sites because it implies a hierarchy and a contemporaneity. But in 2018, geophysical survey by Richard Bates on behalf of Ursula and Tursika and the Callanish Trust found some spectacular evidence at Callanish 11, Eri Nabena Biga. He found evidence for a lightning strike, slap bang in the middle of this stone circle. And this raises the question, the sort of chicken and egg question, which came first? Was this a site where lightning had struck, maybe it struck a tree, and people thought, right, that is a numinous, an appropriate place to put our stone circle? Or had they already erected a stone circle and then lightning struck? We just don't know, unfortunately. But luckily, Richard Bates's geophysical work continues, and he got a wonderful Year of Coast and Waters grant from Historic Environment Scotland. The work was delayed so that some of it only started last July. The last bit has only just ended last weekend. But what Richard was able to do on behalf of the Callanish Trust was geophysical survey at a large number of the stone circles. And here you see here a transect across Callanish 3 to check on the position of any other standing stones that may have existed or fallen in the past, and to see if there are any interior features that are there. The Year of Coasts and Waters work also involved fantastic shore field walking that was undertaken on our behalf by Joe Hambley and Tom Dawson of Scape. So using local volunteer people as a community archaeology project, they walked over 8 kilometers of the shore, and what they found was a submerged field wall under the peat, and they also found a flint flake, along with a lot of much more recent sites. So they're helping to fill in the details. And this kind of coastal walking is essential to, particularly at this time now of climate change, when at this time of the year you get those horrendous strong storms that scour the coast around the Outer Hebrides. And so we may be sure that many, many new sites have been exposed and are being eroded away by the storms which have been happening over the last few weeks and will continue to happen, very sadly. So what's needed is much more of this kind of work. The other thing that Richard Bates is doing, and what he was doing last weekend, was a bathymetry survey and underwater geophysics of Loch Rogue itself to assess the changing level of the loch at different times in prehistory, and to see whether there are any sites that are buried under the water. So, meanwhile, to finish up with a little bit about Ursula and Tursika and what we do. I'm privileged enough to be a board member of the Callanish Trust, and I'm absolutely delighted that we were able to appoint, thanks to grant funding from Historic Environment Scotland, our wonderful community engagement officer, Lucy McLean, who is our secret weapon. And so Lucy, during the most challenging times of COVID, she was able to coordinate the Year of Coast and Waters project. She has been organising all sorts of events and she's been collaborating with Anne Lamper in Stornoway to organise this year's astronomy event, which is coming up in February this year, and I highly recommend it to you. She's going to be establishing a young archaeologist club, and she has been working on the social media aspect, and we've got a brand new website that's going to go live within the next 2 weeks or so. And on that website you'll find a series of podcasts and blogs called Callanish Conversations, which she's been making along with the amazing, wonderful prehistory guys. And we're going to be adding to this. So the latest one was Mel Johnson talking about her work at Callanish Fields. We're going to get Geraint to talk about his work at Knock and Thursa. So, and the most challenging thing that Orkney and Torrekin will be doing is we want to completely revamp the visitor centre, which is now coming up to 27 years old. And we want to expand the area of the display, which explains about and sets Callanish in its broader context. So at the moment, the visitor centre consists of the banana-shaped building here, where you've got a fantastic cafe and you've got a display area here. According to our new plans, we're going to redevelop this so that the whole of this area is dedicated to display and interpretation. And we're going to build on to the existing farmhouse. And this is where we're going to have our wonderful new cafe and an expanded shop with lovely views from it as well. So this is a £5.5 million project. We've bid for island steel money. We've just heard last week that Highlands and Islands Enterprise are giving us enough money to get this through the planning regulation and planning permissions stage of the process, and we'll be actively fundraising we've already started, and we'll be continuing to do this. We've called the project Callanish 2025, and we would rather like it to be finished in time for what we envisage to be a huge influx of visitors when the moon does its thing at Callanish. So I hope you've enjoyed this sort of whistle-stop tour through the longue durée of Callanish. And if you've got any questions, please make them nice and simple. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was fantastic and a really wonderful level of detail, both of the best known elements of the complex, but also it's good to see a plea for more to be done on the other aspects as well, because of course there's so many other sites up there that are just begging for stuff to be done at them, and it has always puzzled me as well. I guess it's just part of the way of things that Orkney gets so much attention, and Shetland doesn't get that much, and the Western Isles gets even less. So there's definitely an imbalance in terms of the islands that archaeologists tend to head to with a Neolithic focus. There's a couple of questions, but I was going to ask one first, if you don't mind, and this is maybe easily put to bed. But my only visit to Callanish was with the NSG, I don't know, a decade ago or so, and we visited the site, the Callanish 10, which is the Collins site with the stones that were perched up and not really set very deeply. And there was a lot of discussion amongst the people, amongst folk there, as to whether it really was a stone circle or not, or whether it was just a quarry site. And it just happened there was stones lying about and they fortuitously looked like it could be a circle. Do you have any strong sense as to whether that, of the nature of that monument?
I'm very aware of that. But what Colin also found was small stones that could have been very, very shallow stone packing. And I know that this work was done as part of a broader project where he was trying to find out the source of the stones that were used to make the main site at Callanish. And he actually discovered then that particular stone had probably come from very, very close to the site. So there was no need to suggest that that the stone that he found at Nadramanan at site 10 had been transported a long distance to Callanish 1. So even though the evidence for settings is very, very ephemeral, I think I'd like to give, unusually for me, I'd like to give Colin the benefit of the doubt and say I think he was right. And I think in the challenging geology of Lewis, in that particular case, they were hoping that they would stand up, but they just didn't. And obviously we don't know how long they did stand until they fell over. I think it's, because the other thing, if they were just being quarried, why would you leave them in a kind of a roughly circular arrangement? It doesn't really make sense that way.
Yeah, I think that the chief poo-pooer was Tim Darville, actually. But yeah, I think that, and also Colin has experience of shallowly set standing stones at the Ring of Brodgar, which is one of the reasons why a lot of the stones there had fallen over. Yeah. Okay, so I've got a question from Joanna Valdis Tullett. Would the standing stones of Macri Moor also have been influenced by the ones in Stenes, They seem to be similarly tall and of similar shapes. Are there evidence of connections between the two islands?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, Diana. Hi. Yes, as I was trying to show in that slide of the arc of stone circles and grooved ware finds along the western side of Scotland. Absolutely, I think Macrimore has got many points of similarity, not just with Callanish, but with the stones of Stoness, and excavations there by Alison Haggerty in the late 1980s. Was able to show that there was a sequence. So they started by building timber circles, and then they converted them into stone. And associated with the timber circles, you get very early grooved ware pottery. And there's been a fantastic project by Mike Copper called Tracing the Lines, and he was able to get direct radiocarbon dates from the burnt on organic residue on the pottery, the grooved ware from Macrimore, to demonstrate that, yep, that was the timber circle there was erected around the 30th century BC. So yes, absolutely. And also, I mean, the fact that we haven't got any timber circles in Orkney doesn't mean that they didn't exist there. I think they're much harder to find, and the ones that have been found when people were excavating stone circles. So it's the same story in Kilmartin Glen at Temple Wood, where Jack Scott excavated. There's Templewood South, which is an all stone circle, and very close to it there's Templewood North that started its life as a wooden circle and then was made into a stone circle. And then people came and they took the stones away and they redeployed them during the early Bronze Age in the very rich graves in Kilmartin Glen. So that too, that's got an amazing long story there, and you can read all about it in my article on Kilmartin in I can get the book for you. It's in one of the Prehistoric Society research papers.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think they're also they're all monuments that are very much belong to their landscape, with the the geology of the surrounding landscapes really exposed in interesting ways at all of those different monuments. So
absolutely. And also at Macrimore, you've got this same phenomenon of the Me Too stone circles. So again, date-wise, what we can say about them is that they predate the early Bronze Age, because you get secondary, you get the insertion of kists and the people were burying people inside these stone circles then. But again, Macrimore is just, for all the wonderful work that Alison did, we need to get the so-called satellite sites dated as well better.
Watch this space is all I will say on that subject.
Oh yes, of course, yes.
So the next question is from Paul Dufty, and I'm not entirely sure, you can interpret this question as you want. The question is, it starts with, this might be a stupid question, but I'm not going to say it is, but because it's just I'm not quite sure exactly the emphasis here, but the question is there any relationship with the number of stone circles in Aberdeenshire?
Oh, no. It's a very good question. It's not a stupid question at all. Date-wise, the stone circles that we find in Aberdeenshire were constructed much, much later than Callanish and the stones of Stoness and Macrimore. So work by Richard Bradley on the recumbent stone circles, which are so numerous in Aberdeenshire, and also on the Claver cairns, which, I'll just talk about the recumbent stone circles, concluded that they were probably constructed around 2300 to 2100 BC, during the Chalcolithic period, during the time when people were using beaker pottery. But they have a funny parallel with practices at Callanish, insofar as this was an example where local people were using they're using beaker pottery, which was a continental style pottery, but they were using it within a local idiom. So they were built, these things would have been tombs of very, very important people. So when you excavate a recumbent stone circle, quite often you find cremated remains in the center of them. Yeah, and so the stone circle would then be built around this, and then people would and they would use the recumbents as a sort of a frame to focus on distant parts of the horizon. It used to be thought that it was specifically lunar orientation, but now it's thought that no, it was broader than that. It was particularly areas on the horizon, and there are some solar orientations as well as lunar.
Thanks. And there was a related question from Maggie McCann, who asked about the Claver cairns. and the stone
Oh, good.
circles there. So
Okay, yeah, and those are really interesting as well, because they represent another variant of the idea of people in the Copper Age wanting to create really, really special graves for local bigwigs. Yeah, and even though the passage tombs superficially look a little bit like Neolithic passage tombs, they're not. Yeah, and again, they've been excavated, some of them by Richard Bradley. He found beaker pottery associated with Balnurin of Clava south, and date-wise, again, he thinks they were probably 2,300 to 2,100. They have a very definite archaeoastronomical orientation on the midwinter solstice setting sun, but also their lunar orientations as well. And there you have the use of cup marks, which is really, really interesting, because the fantastic Scottish rock art project that Joanna Valdez-Tullett has been such a big part of, and you as well, Kenny, has found that actually there aren't all that many cut marks or rock art in the Outer Hebrides. There's some, but not half as much as there is elsewhere in Scotland.
thank you. Excellent, very, very clear answer, and we're giving a good geographical journey around the country this evening. But let's go back to Callanish again, and the question from Drew Conlon, and this has very much struck a chord with me during Jane Down's Dalrymple lectures. Drew's was disturbed to hear about the flooding, etc., means visitors can no longer enter the Ring of Brodgar. Are there similar threats like this at Callanish related to climate change for visitors?
Not so much climate change as such, but there certainly are threats from visitor numbers. And this is something that Historic Environment Scotland, who are actually, so they're responsible for the stones, and Ursman Tursken is only responsible for the visitor centre. But HES have noticed, as have we, that people can walk freely, and there's quite a bit of erosion, particularly around the chamber tomb. I was up there filming in a absolutely dreich July this year. There were sort of 2 days when you got so wet that it took hours and hours to dry out, and people were still, the kiddies were sort of jumping down into the center of the chamber, and you could see the clay getting eroded there. This is unsustainable, and as part of the developments for Callanish 2025, there is this question that we want to be able to bring together the stones and the visitor center and have more integrated interpretation of them. It might mean having to control where people may and may not go for the sake of preserving the stones for the future, because there's no point in loving a site so much that you just erode it away to nothing. And I know that at the Ring of Brodgar, footfall erosion has been a huge problem there. And of course, and in Lewis, as in Orkney, there is this prospect of large ocean-going cruise ships coming in. They're trying to develop Stornoway as a large ocean cruise port, and if that's the case, you're going to get thousands of people coming, and there has to be some way of managing the flow of visitors that way.
Yeah, I mean that's been quite transformative for the Arcadian economy, but it's come with lots of negatives as well, and I think that
Yes.
It'll be interesting to see how that affects the Western Isles as well.
Yes, but now there's also a great awareness of the need to develop sustainable tourism. So it's not just control the number of people, and also distribute them around all, because Callanish is not the only wonderful site in the Outer Hebrides. Try and get them to visit other sites too, and also develop modes of transport that are electric. So electric bike hire. You get people to park away from the stones, because parking is a complete nightmare. And then if you have something like an electric shuttle minibus, bring them to the site that way. All of these are huge issues that the board is trying to address with the help of the local community.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll pop to there's a question from Graham, who was there when that amazing photograph was taken of the silhouette on the moon. But I'm going to go to the chat for a question just now. Thanks Stephen for pointing it out there. Questions from Ingrid. So there's two parts to this. the first part I'll paraphrase. Essentially, has anyone looked at the significance associated with the shapes of the stones at Callanish? Some of them look similar to the big stones at Callanish, even though they're on different rock types. So is there any work been done on the shapes of the stones themselves?
Yes, indeed. Margaret Curtis, or Margaret Ponting, as she was, has done an awful lot of work, and she has spoken and written very eloquently about the possible significance of the shapes of the stones, and suggesting some are male, some are female, and the same suggestion has been made for the stones of Callanish. I think it's quite plausible. I'm sure these weren't accidental. They didn't just take any old stones, and they would have been obviously the kind of the narrowness of the stones is due to the fact that in both cases the rock itself is planar, it laminates, so it's going to give you stones which are tall and basically narrow. But in terms of shaping them, the kind of zigzaggy ones or the point thingies, I'm sure there was a lot of thought that went into the shaping of these, and if only we could go back in time and ask the people, that'd be wonderful. And again, this is something that Mike Parker Pearson has talked about with relation to Stonehenge. Whether there had been a belief at the time that these were petrified humans, or that these were the ancestors, and by putting up the stones, you are celebrating the ancestors forever.
Thank
and
you.
I particularly love this thing about the finding by I can't remember his name, the wonderful guy, again working with Margaret, of the Nokan Tursa, and the sun's rays being focused towards what was then so that they put the central standing stone to be in line with that. That's just fabulous. And if you're standing in the cave and the sun is coming down on you, wow, you're kind of it's a bit like plugging a car into an electric thing. Yeah, you're getting the power of the sun, just as then people got the power of the moon. Amazing.
And I think Margaret's actually in the audience.
Oh, hooray! I want to meet you, Margaret. I love your work. I will be up one day. I have the greatest respect for it.
I'll go back to the chat for all over the screen here, from Ingrid. I suspect this one might be dealt with a bit more quickly. Wait a minute. Find it. Yeah, so Ingrid's is doubtful of whether this point will be taken seriously or not, I think, but she's said, has anyone noticed the fact that if you draw a line between Callanish and Callanish, it crosses the central point of Cape Wrath, which is equidistant from both circles? Or is this just a bizarre coincidence?
I suspect it's probably a bizarre coincidence, but it reminds us that the northwest mainland of Scotland, as reviewed recently in the brand new Highland Archaeological Research Framework, go watch it, folks, is a very, very under-researched area. Further to the south at Arisaig, there is a very interesting stone that has got designs on it that are very much like Orcadian grooved-ware designs. So there are these sort of scratched lozenges, which themselves represent an adoption and adaptation of the sacred symbols of Irish Pashtun art. So yes, I'm sure there is more to be found. And indeed, there is survey work by Steph Piper of Newcastle University at Wav Vor near Gairloch, where she has found early Neolithic pottery, very early Neolithic pottery, dating to around 3800 BC, which unfortunately the bits are so tiny that we can't tell whether these were Breton or Northern French. Are they Lake Castalic? Are they carinated bowl pottery? But it just goes to show that there's a lot more that will be there to be found if we only look.
Thanks. And thanks, Ingrid, for those questions. And there's always a great joy in having a map and a ruler, but it generally doesn't necessarily lead anywhere that takes you anywhere any other than just for your own amusement. But still, it can be fun. Now we'll turn now to Graham Gardner, who, as I said, was there when that amazing silhouette photograph was taken, which I didn't realise. I'll need to speak to Graham about that some other time. His question is it reasonable to assume contemporaneous construction of the other Callanish sites based on their astronomical alignments? I'm thinking of Margaret Curtis's Callanish diamond.
Yeah, I think that has to count as a working hypothesis that is waiting to be tested. I think it's quite possible that several, if not most, if not all of the stone circles were constructed as a response to the main Callanish site. And I think that just as in Orkney, maybe there was very much this Me Too thing. So it was a kind of competitive, conspicuous consumption, where they've built that amazing site. Oh, we can do that here. And we can also get it orientated on a significant astronomical phenomenon as well. Margaret has done a lot of work. She's done probing of the peat to find out where missing fallen stones are. The geophysical work that Richard has been doing is very valuable in adding to that. I think what we now need is keyhole excavation. Obviously, as Patrick found, you're not always going to find datable material if you excavate a standing stone or a fallen standing stone, but it's worth a go. And I think until we've got actual radiocarbon dates, it has to count as a plausible hypothesis, but one that needs testing.
Thank you for that answer. There's no other questions that are lurking around just now, but just one thing that struck me. Oh, wait a minute. Someone has got a hand. Someone has a hands up.
Okay.
Wait a minute. Oh, I don't know if that. Wait a minute. Participants. Right. Okay. Right. So someone called Elizabeth has got her hands up. I'm not sure. I will allow Elizabeth to talk if she is wanting to. I'm not sure if the hand is up for that reason or not. Not sure. Doesn't look like it.
Or maybe you're just muted. If you unmute, happy to listen.
Oh well, I've removed Elizabeth. Maybe just a hand went up by accident. I think I've actually removed her from the whole meeting. Oops. Oh dear. Oh well. I thought I was just removing her from the main screen. Yeah, I just wanted one final thing to say, Alison, was that when I tweeted about this earlier on, and someone sort of quite snidely got back to me and said, "Oh, so we're not using the old spelling of Callanish anymore."
Yes.
And you were also quite keen to move beyond the whole Callanish 1 to 22 numbering. Yeah. So is that part of this is also about trying to reclaim the kind of the correct names for these sites going forward as well?
Yeah, or rather reclaim the traditional Gaelic names.
Yes, yeah.
We'll never know what the correct
sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
But yes, absolutely, yes. And in fact, Urasnan Turshikan has just been through a rebranding exercise, and we had long and many discussions with the designers about Callanish, Callanish, or Cala, because they said, "Oh, but people pronounce it Calanais," thinking like it's a French word, and you're thinking, "Ay." So I think if Gaelic is a wonderful tradition. It's a tradition that is slightly threatened. It's a tradition that is well worthy of being promoted and kept and preserved. And I know that there is an incredibly active and very strong Gaelic lobby in the Outer Hebrides, so they would feel that it's a non-starter of a question. You have to use the Gaelic spelling. So I think yes, if it's a matter of educating people, yeah, that's the way to do it. And what I would love to have on, and we'll eventually put on our website, is a Gaelic speaker pronouncing the names of the sites properly, rather than me butchering them.
Well, I mean, Stephen could probably comment better on that because he's learning to speak Gaelic and is also a Gaelic speaker as well. So, but he hasn't made any signal that there's any problem with your pronunciations. So there's no more questions. So, but I think we've kept you long enough on a Thursday evening. So once again, I'd like to thank you, Alison, for a really wonderful talk and answering the questions there so generously. And obviously, there's lots more to be done, but I think all of us should try and go up to Lewis at some point, visit the site and see the wonderful work that's happening up there. And good luck to you and the organisation. I look forward to hearing more about all of those activities. So I will now stop recording.